The fog still clings to Baker Street tonight, soft, heavy, and watchful. In the glow of the hearth, two men sit in silence, one turning the pages of reason, the other haunted by what reason can never cure. From the quiet villages of Wiltshire to the marble heart of London, a strange relic has crossed both continents and consciences, leaving behind whispers of faith, greed, and guilt that no superstition could explain. It is a tale not of ghosts, but of the debts that follow men home from war, of a soldier's madness and a detective's calm pursuit of truth amid the ruins of belief. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what hour finds you there tonight? The coals burn low, the city clock prepares to strike, and somewhere beyond the fog, the story of the Ivory and the Soul begins. It was upon one of those November evenings, when London seems drowned in its own breath, that I sat by the fire in our Baker Street lodgings, lost in the comfort of warmth and flame. The windows were a blur of yellow haze, and beyond them, the great city slept uneasily beneath its pall of fog. Holmes sat opposite me, his long, lean form bent over the Times, his pipe unlit but between his fingers as if in companionable thought. The air was heavy with that peculiar stillness which precedes discovery. I had long since learnt that my friend's quietude was never idleness. The delicate arch of his brows, the faint tapping of his fingers upon the newspaper column, these were the preludes to some mental pursuit as exacting as any hunt through the wilderness. From time to time, he would murmur a phrase beneath his breath, his eyes darting back to the page with renewed intent. It was a familiar ritual, one that filled me with both affection and curiosity. In that dimly lit room, amid the fog's encroaching silence, I felt the first stirrings of a mystery which had yet to make itself known, a mystery that would soon carry us far from London's smoke into the cold, haunted heart of rural England. "My dear Watson," said Holmes at length, lowering the newspaper with that peculiar spark in his eye which heralded the scent of a problem, "you may find this small notice diverting." He handed me the page and indicated a column of brief announcements, those strange personal advertisements which, as he often remarked, serve as a mirror to the secret life of a great city. My eye fell upon the words, "To those who hold faith with the sacred relic, the hour of atonement is near. The cross awaits its keeper." "Surely some religious crank," I ventured. "Possibly," said Holmes, with that indulgent tone he reserved for my simpler explanations. "Yet mark you, the same notice has appeared thrice this week, each time with subtle alterations. Observe the increasing urgency of the phrasing. It suggests design, not madness." He resumed his seat, fingers steepled, his expression half amusement, half calculation. "You see, Watson, what mankind calls superstition is merely ignorance of cause and effect. Somewhere behind this relic and its atonement lies a hand, a very human hand." At that moment, a sharp rap upon the door interrupted our discussion. Mrs. Hudson's discreet voice followed. "A gentleman to see you, sir. He seems distressed." The man who entered was of middle years, tall yet stooped, as though bowed beneath an invisible weight. His clerical collar and travel-stained coat proclaimed his calling and his fatigue in equal measure. His pale, earnest face was marked by sleeplessness, and when he removed his gloves, I noted the tremor of hands accustomed more to benediction than to worldly struggle. "I am Reverend Elias Fairborn," he said, his voice low and uneven. "You will forgive this intrusion, Mr. Holmes, but I am sorely troubled and have nowhere else to turn." Holmes rose courteously, motioned him to the chair nearest the fire, and regarded him with that expression of quiet sympathy which often reassured the most agitated of clients. "You are most welcome, Mr. Fairborn. Pray compose yourself and tell us what evil wind brings you to Baker Street on such a night." The clergyman drew from his coat a small leather case, which he placed gently upon his knees, as though it contained a sleeping infant, His eyes darted toward it with a curious mingling of fear and reverence. "It is this, sir," he whispered. "This object, and the curse that walks with it. 3 deaths have come since it returned from India, and I fear my household will not long survive its presence." A faint smile flickered upon Holmes's lips, though his gaze remained intent. "Ah," he murmured softly, "then the relic of our advertisements has found its voice." Reverend Fairbairn's story, as he unfolded it in our dimly lit sitting room, was one that seemed torn from the darker annals of empire. His late brother-in-law, Colonel Arthur Marbury, had served in India during the Mutiny of '57 and had brought home with him a singular relic, an ivory crucifix said to have been carved by the disciples of St. Aurelius, a martyr revered by certain Eastern converts. "It was taken," said the clergyman, "from the ruins of a mission where all had perished. The colonel declared it a treasure of faith. Others whispered it was stolen from the dead. He died within a year of its arrival, and since then—" Fairbairn's voice faltered. "A maid fell ill and died without cause. Last month the vestry caught fire under strange circumstances. And now, my niece, Clara, she wastes daily, and I fear she will follow the rest." Throughout the account, Holmes had remained perfectly motionless, his eyes half closed, save for an occasional flicker of the lids. When Fairbairn paused, he leaned forward. "These misfortunes," said he, "coincided precisely with the relic's return to your home." "Yes, the cross has never left the rectory." "Describe it to me." "It is of purest ivory, intricately carved with coiling serpents about the base, symbolic, perhaps, of the triumph of faith over evil." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "Indeed, and you believe, sir, that what afflicts your household is supernatural?" Fairbairn's answer came in a whisper. "I fear it is beyond man's reason, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's smile deepened ever so slightly. "Then, Reverend, let us see how far man's reason may stretch before yielding to fear." When the clergyman had gone, taking with him his leather case and his burden of dread, Holmes remained standing by the fire, his gaze fixed upon the glowing coals. For some minutes neither of us spoke. At last he turned to me with that peculiar gleam which I had come to associate with the scent of a new chase. "Superstition, Watson," said he quietly, "is the poetry of fear. It veils guilt, conceals motive, and excuses crime. I fancy our good Reverend is not haunted by spirits, but by something far more tangible." "You think, then, that there is a human cause behind these tragedies?" "My dear fellow," he replied, lighting his pipe, "when we have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And human guilt, I assure you, is never impossible." He took up his violin, drew a single note, and let it linger in the smoky air. "Pack your bag, Watson. We go to Wiltshire by the morning train. There is something in that rectory which has killed thrice, and I propose to make its acquaintance before it claims a fourth." The fog thickened outside, pressing against the window panes like a living thing, and I felt, as I often had before, that the world was about to reveal another of its hidden, dreadful secrets to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Reverend Fairbairn began his account in a tone both solemn and subdued, his eyes lowered as though burdened by the memory he must recall. "Colonel Arthur Marbury," said he, "my late brother-in-law, was a man of unflinching courage, yet his death was preceded by a torment that no earthly weapon could have inflicted. He told us how Marbury, serving in India during the rebellion of 1857, had seized from a burning chapel a relic of curious workmanship, an ivory crucifix said to contain within it a fragment of the sainted Aurelius's bones. "It was meant to be holy," continued the clergyman, "yet the soldiers whispered it had been torn from the hands of dying men." When the colonel returned home, his once proud spirit was shadowed by remorse, and he spoke at times of eyes that followed him across the sea. Holmes, who had been lounging with apparent indifference, turned his gaze sharply toward our visitor. "A spoil of desecration," he murmured. "An object born of faith, stolen by force. That, my dear Watson, is a relic already half accursed." The Reverend clasped his trembling hands together. "You speak truly, sir. The curse, if curse it be, began its work soon after the cross entered our home." I saw the faintest smile flicker across Holmes's lips. "A curse?" he repeated softly. "Or merely the first shadow of conscience made visible?" Fairbairn's voice grew unsteady as he spoke of the first tragedy. It was a winter morning, grey and bitterly cold. The maid, Alice Trent, was found lifeless beside the relic, which rested upon the vestry table. Her face was peaceful, yet her lips were marked with white. The doctor could offer no explanation, save that her heart had stopped. He paused, his knuckles whitening as he clasped the arms of his chair. I had placed the cross there the night before, intending to bless it upon the morrow. She must have entered the vestry early to dust the furnishings. When I found her, the faintest powder lay upon her skin, like frost. "The powder," said Holmes sharply. "Was it examined?" "No, sir. I confess I was too overcome to question Providence." Holmes's expression softened, though his tone remained precise. "And the parish, what did they say?" "They whispered that divine wrath had fallen. They spoke of sacrilege, of saints avenged. I buried the matter quietly. It seemed safer to be silent." Holmes rose and began pacing. "You did wisely for your peace, Reverend, but unwisely for your truth. The smallest detail may hold the soul of a crime. Tell me, at what hour was the body found?" "6:30. "And her last duties?" "To polish the brass in the vestry." Holmes nodded gravely. "So, death comes to one who served the church, and leaves a trace of ivory dust behind. It is no spirit that kills with such discrimination." The Reverend took a deep breath before continuing. "The second misfortune came but a month later. I had locked the relic in the vestry safe, hoping to remove it from sight. Yet one night, flames burst forth from that very chamber. The villagers roused me from my bed. By the time we broke down the door, smoke filled the nave. Every wooden article had been consumed, all but the ivory cross, which lay unscathed amidst the ashes." "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, leaning forward with interest. "Was the window open?" Fairbairn hesitated. "Yes, a small casement overlooking the graveyard." "And the key to the vestry? Who held it?" "Myself, the sexton, and my servant, Ram Das." "Ah," said Holmes softly. "An Eastern name. Continue, if you please." "The fire brigade declared it an accident, though none could say how it began. That same night, Ram Das vanished without a word. I feared some guilt of his own had driven him to flight, but the villagers insisted he had fled the curse." Holmes made a note in his little book. "One servant dead, another vanished, and a relic that defies destruction. This cross, Reverend, seems to attract misfortune as a magnet draws iron filings." "I cannot deny it, Mr. Holmes," Fairbairn whispered. "I prayed that the trials had ended, yet heaven was not done with me." Holmes's grey eyes flickered toward the fire. Perhaps not heaven, but another agency entirely. It was at this point that Fairbairn's tone softened, and his composure gave way to deep emotion. "My niece, Clara Marbury, was ever the light of my household," said he. "2 months ago, she fell ill, not with fever, but with a wasting faintness that no physician could name. Her strength ebbs daily. Each morning, the maid finds on her bedclothes a dust like ground ivory. Yet the cross remains untouched in its case." Holmes bent over his microscope, through which he had been examining a small vial of powder the Reverend had brought. I watched him with growing fascination as he adjusted the lens, his brow furrowed in silent calculation. "This substance," said he at length, "is crystalline, not organic. Arsenic, Watson, in fine particulate form, enough to kill if inhaled over time." The clergyman gave a start, his face paling. Arsenic. Then this is no curse of heaven. Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. Faith, Reverend, can blind a man faster than fever. You see divine retribution. I see a human hand guided by guilt and cunning. But who, I cried, would harm an innocent girl? That, my dear Watson, Holmes replied, is precisely what we must learn. The one who poisons by dust must know the relic's every resting place. Fairbairn pressed his hand to his brow. You think someone within my house... Holmes interrupted gently. I think, sir, that the cross is less a symbol of faith than of ownership, and that someone, somewhere, believes it was never yours to keep. The words seemed to hang in the air like a chill wind, and I could see that even the Reverend, a man of Scripture, trembled before their implication. Holmes's questions turned once more to the missing servant. Tell me of Ram Das, said he. How long had he served your household? For 6 years, Fairbairn replied. He was loyal, quiet, and devout in his way. My brother-in-law brought him from Delhi after the war. He spoke often of his people and their saints. I trusted him. And before his disappearance, he had grown restless, the clergyman admitted. He warned me that the relic was not ours, that it must be returned to the place where the saint sleeps. His words frightened Clara, and I forbade him to speak of it. That night he left, taking nothing but a small carved token he always wore about his neck. Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. And you never saw him again? Never. Only the villagers' tales, that he was seen walking by the river, muttering prayers. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A servant who vanishes after fire and death is rarely a mere fugitive. I should like, Watson, to know what the good Ram Das truly sought. Redemption or revenge. Fairbairn clasped his hands in despair. I fear both, Mr. Holmes. There are nights when I believe his spirit still watches over the cross. Holmes smiled faintly. Spirits, my dear Reverend, rarely leave footprints, but men always do. He closed his notebook with a snap. Come, Watson, we shall visit Wiltshire at once. I fancy that this curse has a very earthly author, and I mean to shake his hand before he strikes again. And with that, the fate of the Ivory Cross, and of all who clung to it, began to unfold. Our journey from London to the West Country was one of unbroken melancholy. The November rain fell with a slow persistence, painting the carriage windows in rivulets that blurred the countryside into shifting shadows. Holmes sat opposite me, his sharp profile half lost in the dim light, a sheaf of letters spread across his knee. They were Fairbairn's, the same correspondence that had first roused his interest, and he was now re-examining them with that peculiar mixture of absorption and serenity which marked his most formidable moods. From time to time, he would raise his eyes, glance through the misted pane, and then fall again to silent thought. Once only did he speak, more to himself than to me. There are crimes, Watson, that spring not from malice, but from memory. The dead are poor counsellors, yet they command strange obedience from the living. I made no answer. The rhythmic beat of the wheels and the low hiss of the rain lulled me into a state between reflection and unease. We had followed Holmes into peril before, yet never had the moral shadow seemed so heavy, nor the human element so entangled with faith and guilt. As dusk settled, the black line of trees gave way to the faint outline of a steeple against the lowering clouds. Holmes folded the letters and said quietly, "Wiltshire, my dear Watson, let us see what tragedy hides behind its silence." We found the little parish of St. Aurelius to be one of those forgotten English hamlets where time seems reluctant to move. The lane wound between moss-grown walls and cottages, whose thatched roofs bowed under the weight of centuries. A grey mist hung about the church spire, and from its tower came no sound. Its bells, as we soon learned, had not rung in years. The villagers regarded us with the wary glances of those to whom misfortune has become a superstition. They whispered as we passed, and I caught more than once the words, "the cursed cross," murmured between them. It was not hostility that marked their faces, but dread, that peculiar fear which clings to isolated minds and gives birth to legends. Holmes seemed untroubled by their stares. Indeed, he appeared to draw energy from the gloom, his keen eyes darting from church to rectory with quiet calculation. "Observe, Watson," said he, "how fear breeds silence. In such a soil, even the simplest crime may take root unnoticed." We reached the rectory as the evening deepened. It was a sober dwelling of grey stone, fronted by neglected hedges and half drowned in ivy. A dim light showed through one of the lower windows, and at the door stood Reverend Fairbairn, his expression one of anxious relief. "My niece awaits you within," he said. "I thank heaven you have come, though I fear it is already too late." Clara Marbury was a young woman of no more than 25, yet the illness that confined her had already touched her features with premature pallor. Her eyes, though shadowed by fatigue, retained that quiet intelligence which reveals both courage and restraint. When she greeted us, it was with the faint composure of one who had long ceased to hope, but would not yield to despair. "I cannot tell you, Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "what comfort your presence brings to my uncle and to me. Strange things have happened here, things no reason can explain. Yet I feel you will see through them as daylight pierces fog." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "We shall do what daylight does, Miss Marbury, though it may fall upon shadows that others prefer unlit." At his request, she spoke of a figure that had been seen near the churchyard at dusk, tall, wrapped in a dark coat, and moving always toward the vestry. "Once," she whispered, "I thought it was my uncle's servant returned from the grave. The villagers say so still." I confess her words chilled me, for there was something in her tone that carried conviction beyond fancy. Holmes, however, regarded her steadily, his gaze analytical, yet not unkind. "Fear," said he at last, "is the greatest accomplice of crime. We must strip it away, Miss Marbury, and see what remains beneath." Her lips trembled faintly, but she smiled. "Then I shall pray your reason proves stronger than our terror, Mr. Holmes." That evening, beneath a lowering sky, Holmes and I ventured into the churchyard behind the rectory. The rain had ceased, but the ground was sodden, and our lantern threw long, wavering circles upon the leaning headstones. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. "This place, Watson," Holmes murmured, "has known both faith and folly. Look there, the soil newly turned." He pointed to a mound near the vestry door where the ground appeared disturbed, the grass uprooted in a narrow strip. As we approached, my foot sank slightly, revealing the outline of a footprint, slender, deliberate, and pointing toward the church. Holmes crouched and examined it with his magnifying lens. "The stride is regular," said he. "No sign of haste. This is no prowler seeking theft, but a man moving with purpose. See, the depth of the heel, light yet certain. He has been here often." We followed the prints to the vestry window, where the latch bore faint scratches. Holmes traced them gently with his fingertip and smiled. "Someone wished entry, and has found it more than once. Observe the residue upon the sill. Ivory dust. Our phantom, it seems, has material habits." As he spoke, a chill wind stirred the yew branches overhead, and I could have sworn I heard the echo of a low sigh. Holmes replaced his lens and said quietly, "Come, Watson. The dead do not disturb their own graves. There is a hand behind this, and I mean to find whose it is." We returned to the rectory, where Fairbairn awaited us anxiously in the study. At Holmes's request, he unlocked a small cabinet and brought forth the relic itself. Under the lamplight, the ivory cross gleamed with an unearthly beauty, its pale surface carved in winding serpents that twined about the base, their eyes faintly glistening like drops of dew. Holmes regarded it for some moments in silence. Then, taking a penknife from his pocket, He scraped a fragment from the lower edge and set it upon a strip of paper moistened with reagent. The reaction was immediate, a faint discoloration spreading like smoke. "Arsenic," said Holmes simply. Fairborn staggered back, his hand upon his breast. "Poison. Then it was no curse at all." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "a curse of human making, and a subtle one. Whoever tampered with this relic understood both chemistry and psychology. To lace a sacred object with death is to kill the body through the soul." I stared in astonishment at the pale dust that shimmered upon Holmes's fingertip. "You mean the deaths, the illness, were no miracles, Watson," said he. "Only the old story, greed, guilt, and the science of fear. But our culprit is not yet unmasked. There remains the question of motive and of method." He turned the cross once more under the light, his eyes narrowing upon a faint groove at its base. "Yes," he murmured, "this work is not of heaven's making. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall visit the house of its earthly author." It was upon the following morning that Holmes announced his intention of tracing the vanished servant to his last known abode, a riverside hamlet some miles distant. The road wound through grey meadows and fields sodden by rain, and the air carried that faint odour of decay peculiar to English autumns. By the time we reached the little settlement, the mist had risen from the Avon like a veil, leaving behind a melancholy quiet that seemed native to the place. The few inhabitants we encountered eyed us with undisguised mistrust. They spoke of the Indian, Ram Das, in tones of mingled pity and dread, calling him the heathen who prayed by night among the graves. One man swore he had seen the foreigner kneeling beside the churchyard wall, murmuring to himself and scattering handfuls of dust upon the ground. Another averred that he had heard a chant, low and rhythmic, which chilled his blood. Through these fragments of gossip, Holmes listened without interruption, save for an occasional question, short and exact. His grey eyes had assumed that distant expression I knew so well. The look of a mind reconstructing order from chaos. "There is method even in fear, Watson," he said at last. "When a whole village remembers a man for his silence, it is not his madness, but his purpose that has unsettled them." As we turned toward the river, the wind carried with it the faint rush of water over stones, a whispering that seemed almost articulate, as though the Avon itself desired to speak the truth the living dared not utter. At the solitary inn beside the river, we found an elderly hostess, a woman with sharp eyes and a tongue to match, who greeted us with wary curiosity. It was she, Holmes learned, who had given Ram Das shelter during his final days. "A quiet soul, sir," she said, shaking her head. "He would sit by the fire till midnight, staring at that thing he wore around his neck. A carving it was, ivory, I think, shaped like a saint's face. He'd rub it between his fingers and mutter about forgiveness." Holmes inclined his head. "Did he ever speak of the cross?" The woman crossed herself quickly. "Aye, many times. He said it was the soul of a dead saint defiled, taken from holy ground, stained with English blood. He wanted to send it home, back to the earth that bore it. I told him he was a fool to meddle with such things. The next morning, he was gone." Her story ended there, but Holmes remained motionless, his fingertips pressed together, and his gaze fixed upon the dying embers in the grate. When he spoke again, it was almost to himself. "Superstition may wear the mask of truth, and truth, the cloak of superstition. The difficulty, Watson, lies in discerning which is which." As we took our leave, he added quietly, "There is remorse in this tale, and fear, but they do not belong to the same man. Mark that, Watson. Fear belongs to the living, remorse, most often, to the guilty dead." His words lingered in my mind as we approached the riverbank, where the fate of Ram Das awaited us beneath the drifting fog. The Avon ran slow and black beneath the tangled willows, its surface unbroken, save by the pale drift of leaves. It was here, the innkeeper told us, that the servant's body had been found some weeks before, half submerged among the reeds. The verdict had been suicide, though even the coroner had admitted certain peculiarities, which the villagers were content to attribute to foreign wickedness. Holmes crouched beside the bank, studying the mud with a care that to me seemed needless. "Observe," said he, pointing to a patch of flattened grass near the water's edge. Here the body was dragged, not rolled, as in the case of self-drowning. Note, too, the double impression of heels, one deep, one light. There was another man here, Watson, and he was stronger than his victim. He produced from his pocket the coroner's notes, which he had obtained through some mysterious channel, and read them rapidly. Bruising about the throat, attributed to weeds or rope. Yet look at the photograph. The marks are transverse, not vertical. And here, the pendant he always wore, missing. Curious, is it not, that a man who drowned himself should first remove the one object he called holy? A gust of wind stirred the reeds, and the river answered with a hollow sigh. Holmes rose slowly. No, Watson. Ramdas did not die by his own hand. He knew too much, perhaps of what befell that relic in India, or of those who profited by its theft. His death is the work of silence, not despair. As we turned away, he cast one last glance at the dark, murmuring water. The Avon keeps its secrets, he said, but so does guilt, until it is forced to speak. And in that moment, I understood that the river's whisper was not the only voice that haunted Wiltshire. The hours that followed our return from the river were spent in diligent inquiry, for Holmes was in that mood of intense, controlled activity which I had come to associate with the scent of revelation. While he immersed himself in the parish registers and the constable's reports, I was dispatched to examine the public archives in the neighbouring market town. There, amid yellowed papers and dust-laden volumes, I chanced upon the name that was to give form to all our suspicions, Major Henry Pembroke. The record showed that this officer had served alongside Colonel Arthur Marbury during the Indian Rebellion. His commendations for bravery were matched by darker notes, unverified charges of excessive reprisals, and acts of private vengeance. The last entry, dated some 20 years earlier, marked his retirement and return to England in uncertain health. That he had now taken possession of a small estate within 3 miles of Fairbourne's rectory seemed more than coincidence. When I returned to our lodgings, Holmes was bent over a sheaf of constabulary notes, his eyes glinting with that rare fire which presaged discovery. "Excellent, Watson," he exclaimed when I laid my findings before him. "Pembroke and Marbury, comrades in arms, and it would seem, in guilt. The shadow of one man has fallen upon 2 continents." He tapped the paper thoughtfully. "Here. We have motive that bridges empire and conscience. The cross was not a gift of faith, but a trophy of blood. Pembroke's proximity is no accident. The question is, does he act from fear or from penance?" Before I could answer, Holmes had risen, pacing the room in measured steps. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall visit this soldier of misfortune. The dead may not speak, Watson, but the living cannot long endure their silence." That evening, the wind swept heavily about the rectory, and the lamplight flickered over Holmes's notes as he arranged them with military precision upon the table. I sat opposite him, the faint scent of damp earth still clinging to my coat, while he, absorbed and motionless, stared into the shifting shadows cast by the flame. "Observe, Watson," said he at length, spreading 2 sheets before me. "Here are the twin paths of our inquiry, vengeance and guilt. The first springs from the east, Ram Das, the servant who believed the relic profaned and who sought its redemption through death. The second from the west, Pembroke, the soldier who bears the stain of desecration and would destroy the evidence of his own sin. Each path leads to bloodshed, one for faith, one for silence." He paused, the faintest smile touching his lips. "It is, in essence, a question of which man worships the cross and which fears it." I watched the play of thought upon his features, the quiet intensity, the precise ordering of chaos into reason. "You think Pembroke killed Ramdas?" I ventured. Holmes inclined his head. I think he buried more than one secret in the soil of India, and that conscience, like poison, seeps slowly through the years. Every fact we have points to his hand. The relic's theft, the servant's death, the arsenic dust, all form a pattern too deliberate for chance. The lamplight burned lower. Holmes leaned back, his voice quieter but charged with certainty. This, Watson, is not a tale of ghosts, but of debts unpaid. Each act has been a retribution, each payment made in blood. Tomorrow, the balance shall close. And so, under the waning light, we prepared to meet the man upon whom the shadow of the Ivory Cross had finally fallen. Our road to Major Pembroke's cottage led us through a stretch of wood, so thickly shrouded in mist that the very air seemed muffled by secrecy. The branches stooped low over the narrow path, their wet leaves brushing our shoulders as we passed. From time to time, the distant cry of a night bird or the snapping of a twig startled me with its sharpness against the steady hush of the forest. Holmes, who strode beside me with his usual composure, had not spoken for several minutes. His hat brim was pulled low, his coat collar turned up against the damp. Presently, he said, half to himself, "Seclusion, Watson, is often the first refuge of a guilty conscience. Men flee not from the world's judgment, but from the echo of their own thoughts." Ahead, through the gloom, the faint outline of a dwelling took shape. A small cottage set back among the trees, its windows dark save for one dim gleam. The gate creaked softly as Holmes pushed it open, and I noted a curious flash of metal on the door, an iron latch polished bright from frequent use. Holmes's keen eyes lingered upon it before he knocked. "A military man's home, no doubt," he murmured. "Order and secrecy, the discipline of habit, and the dread of memory." The door opened with a slow scrape of hinges, and a tall, spare figure stood before us, his face drawn and colourless in the lamplight. "Major Pembroke?" Holmes inquired politely. The man inclined his head. "You are expected, Mr. Holmes, though I cannot say I am glad of it." Major Henry Pembroke received us in a sitting room both severe and comfortless. Maps, framed medals, and a few fading watercolours of Indian landscapes adorned the walls. He motioned us to our seats with the grave courtesy of a soldier, yet there was a nervousness about his movements, a tremor in the hand that poured the tea, a flicker of the eyes toward the curtained window, which did not escape my observation. Holmes, meanwhile, had already taken his measure. "You have spent long years in the service, I perceive," said he, glancing at the military tokens about the room. Pembroke's lips tightened. "A lifetime, Mr. Holmes. One that leaves a man with more burdens than medals. There are things one carries home, though he wishes to lay them down upon foreign soil." His voice faltered. In that instant, Holmes's gaze dropped to the man's right hand. One finger was missing at the joint, and upon the palm was a faint scar, cross-shaped, as if seared by flame. Holmes's expression did not change, but I knew at once that the observation had struck him deeply. We remained but half an hour, speaking of indifferent matters. Yet when we took our leave, I remarked upon Pembroke's visible agitation. "He fears discovery," I said. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, not discovery. It is not fear of us, but of something he believes follows him still. You saw the scar, the mark of his own guilt. There are men whose crimes burn upon their flesh as surely as upon their souls." The path back to the rectory lay silent, save for the whisper of the wind in the pines. I had seldom seen Holmes so grave. That night, a tempest swept over Wiltshire. Rain lashed against the windows, and the trees groaned beneath the wind's assault. Sleep eluded me. I lay listening to the storm and to Holmes's measured breathing from the adjoining room. It was close upon 2 o'clock when I started upright at the sharp crash of breaking glass. Within moments, Holmes was at my door, candle in hand, his eyes bright and alert. "Come, Watson," he whispered. "Our visitor has come sooner than I hoped." We hurried down the passage. The study door stood ajar, and a draught of cold air met us as we entered. Fairbairn, in his dressing gown, was already there, pale and trembling. The cabinet that had housed the ivory cross was open, its contents strewn across the floor. The relic itself was gone. Holmes surveyed the disarray calmly, then turned to our distraught host. "Compose yourself, Reverend. The hour of darkness is often the hour of proof. What is stolen may yet return to its thief." He stooped to the hearth, examining something invisible to me. The intruder came by the window, as expected. The catch was loosened earlier today. "You expected this?" I exclaimed. "Certainly." I coated the relic with a trace of phosphorus. Should our nocturnal visitor have touched it, he will find his hands eloquent witnesses by morning. Fairbairn clasped his head in dismay. "You mean the curse?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No curse, sir. Only cause and consequence." Outside, the wind howled through the broken pane like the cry of a restless spirit. Yet beneath it, I fancied I heard the softer, steadier tread of reason. Holmes's mind, already following the unseen trail through the dark. With the first pallor of dawn, Holmes roused me. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with mist. "Bring your revolver, Watson," said he, "and tread lightly. Our phantom left footprints in more than dust last night." We stepped out into the churchyard. The grass, still wet from the rain, shimmered faintly as though sprinkled with pale fire. Holmes pointed downward. "There, the proof of phosphorus. Our thief has betrayed himself most beautifully." Indeed, under the grey morning light, faint luminous marks wound across the sodden ground, footprints glowing with an unearthly hue. We followed them in silence, past the vestry, between the leaning stones, and through the iron gate that opened upon the road. From time to time, Holmes knelt to examine a print more closely. "The stride is firm," he murmured, "the weight evenly distributed. Not panic, but resolve. He carries something. Yes, the cross itself, judging by the drag in the right foot." The trail wound steadily toward the fringe of the woods, where the path grew narrower and the light dimmer. Even there, the phosphorescent prints gleamed like embers. I confess that an eerie sensation stole over me as we pursued that glowing track through the fog. It was as though we followed a spectre, summoned by Holmes's own cunning, a ghost conjured not by faith, but by science. At last the prints turned sharply and ended before a small gate of wrought iron, its latch faintly shining with the same pale residue. Holmes straightened, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "So the circle closes, Watson. The hand that stole the cross has carried it home." We stood before Major Pembroke's door. The faint glow of phosphorus marked the handle and the edges of the threshold. Holmes's knock was firm but unhurried. Within moments, footsteps sounded, and the door creaked open. Pembroke stood before us, pale as the morning mist, the cross clasped in his hand. He seemed about to speak, but Holmes forestalled him with quiet authority. "Major, the relic you hold is more eloquent than words. It tells us where you have been, what you have done, and why your nights afford you no rest." For a moment, I thought Pembroke would strike him. Then the man's shoulders sagged, and the cross slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the stones. "I meant to destroy it," he said hoarsely, "to end the curse, to free myself." Holmes regarded him with unpitying calm. "You sought not freedom, sir, but concealment. You feared exposure more than damnation. The cross did not curse you. Your conscience did." Pembroke's lips moved soundlessly, and he sank into the chair by the doorway, covering his face. Holmes picked up the relic, wrapping it carefully in his handkerchief. "The hour for confession will come, Major," said he. "For now, your silence serves no one. We shall send for the authorities." As we turned back toward the rectory, the mist began to lift, and the faint glow upon the grass faded with the dawn. Holmes's voice broke the stillness. "Every man carries his own relic, Watson. Some carved of ivory, others of memory, and both, when defiled, demand a reckoning. I said nothing, for I felt that Pembroke's reckoning had already begun. It was a night so still that even the whisper of the wind seemed a conscious intruder upon the silence. The air hung, thick with moisture, and the moon, half veiled by drifting cloud, cast a wan gleam upon the hedgerows and the glistening blades of wet grass. Holmes and I lay in concealment, not far from Major Pembroke's estate, where the narrow path skirted the orchard wall and curved toward the churchyard beyond. We had spoken little since leaving the rectory. Holmes, crouched low beside me, watched his watch-glass intently, counting the slow, measured seconds with the precision of a clockmaker. I could see the faint outline of his features, calm, resolute, yet shadowed with thought. At length he murmured, "There are minds, Watson, that destroy themselves in the worship of their own guilt. Pembroke is such a man. His remorse, denied confession, has grown into something monstrous, a faith in his own damnation." I shivered, though the night was not cold. The smell of damp soil, the rustle of distant leaves, and the distant tolling of a single church bell combined to deepen the sense of expectancy that hung between us. Holmes touched my sleeve. "He will come, or cause another to come. A conscience so diseased must act, though its possessor hides from the act itself." I strained my eyes through the gloom, but saw nothing save the faint silver of dew upon the orchard's branches. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from far off, a light flickered, pale and wandering, like a will-o'-the-wisp among the trees. Holmes's fingers closed lightly around my arm. "Hush, Watson," he whispered. "Our hour has struck." Through the drifting mist, that single light advanced with slow, uncertain steps. Its bearer moved as one walking in a dream, pausing now and again as though listening to some inaudible command. As the figure drew nearer, the wavering beam of the lantern revealed not the angular form of Major Pembroke, but that of a woman. "Good heavens," I breathed. "It is Miss Marbury." Holmes's hand restrained me with a gentle pressure. "Not yet," he murmured. "You see her eyes, Watson. She walks not of her own will." Indeed, the sight froze me where I knelt. Clara Marbury's face was as pale as the moonlight that fell upon it. Her eyes, wide and vacant, held no recognition of the world around her. She moved like an automaton, her steps steady, her hands clasped upon something white that gleamed faintly in the half-light. When the lantern swung, I saw that it was the ivory cross, the same relic whose shadow had already brought so much ruin. She passed within 10 yards of us, the faint crunch of her tread mingling with the sigh of the wind. Holmes's breath came evenly beside me. His gaze followed her every motion, calculating, waiting. "There is method here," he whispered. "Suggestion, repetition, perhaps hypnotic control. The mind can be led to its own destruction if the voice is trusted." I felt my heart hammering in my chest. The girl was walking straight toward the low gate that opened into the Abtras churchyard. Holmes rose noiselessly beside me. "When she reaches the wall, we act," he said. "The hand that directs her is near, too near to let her go alone." And even as he spoke, the lantern trembled in her grasp, casting long, distorted shadows among the orchard trees. One of them moved. Holmes stepped forward, silent as a shadow, and called softly, "Miss Marbury." She stopped at once. The lantern fell from her hand and rolled upon the ground, throwing grotesque shapes upon the trunks of the trees. "Miss Marbury," he repeated, in that calm, measured tone which could steady even the most overwrought mind. She turned toward him, her face expressionless, her voice faint and mechanical. "The cross must rest with the dead," she murmured. "He waits. The dead must sleep again." Holmes approached her slowly, his voice low and soothing. "No, Miss Marbury. The dead rest best when the living are freed from their fears. You have walked far enough." For an instant she wavered, her hand tightening upon the relic. Then the blankness in her gaze seemed to deepen, and she began to move again, as if drawn by some invisible thread toward the gate beyond. Holmes caught her wrist gently, his other hand closing around the cross. "You are safe," he said firmly. "Awake and look about you." Her breath quickened. Her lips parted in a faint cry, as though waking from a dream. At that same moment, Holmes glanced toward me and made a small gesture, the signal to draw my revolver. "The true danger, Watson," he said softly, "still hides in the dark." Even as he spoke, a rustle came from the thicket behind us, followed by a low, guttural sound, half curse, half cry. Out of the shadows burst the figure of Major Pembroke, his face distorted by fury and terror, his arm raised as if to strike. Holmes stepped between him and the girl, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. "Enough, Major. The hour of your command is over." And as the lantern's dying flame trembled, I saw the gleam of metal in Pembroke's hand. Before I could fully grasp what had occurred, a sudden commotion broke the stillness of the orchard. Out of the darkness, like a spectre conjured by guilt itself, Major Pembroke hurled himself forward, his face ghastly in the lantern's dying glow. His eyes blazed with a fanatic's light as he cried, "The cross belongs to the dead. You shall not profane it further." Clara shrank back, her hands rising instinctively to shield herself. In his grasp, I saw a small glass vial glint under the moon. Holmes was upon him in a heartbeat, his movements swift as a striking hawk. There came the sound of shattering glass, and an acrid, sickly odour filled the air, a scent that clawed at the throat and eyes. "Stand back, Watson," Holmes called sharply. "The poison is released." I knelt beside the fragments, my medical training prompting instant recognition. "Curare," I said hoarsely. "Instantaneous and deadly. A single drop could paralyze a man within seconds." Holmes regarded the trembling officer before him, his voice as cold as the dawn. "So, Major, this is your relic, not of faith, but of murder. You would have silenced her, as you silenced the servant who knew your guilt." Pembroke's defiance faltered. "I did not kill him," he muttered wildly. "He forced me." His eyes followed me through every prayer, every dream. The cross, it cursed me from the moment I touched it. Holmes's expression softened not a whit. "No, Major, the cross was no curse. It was merely your conscience, shaped in ivory." At that, Pembroke's strength gave way. The man sank upon the cold earth, his face buried in his hands, and his voice broke into a strangled sob that was half confession, half release. When the first pallor of dawn crept over the fields of Wiltshire, the horror of the night seemed at last to loosen its hold. Clara lay resting in the rectory's drawing-room, her breathing calm and natural. Holmes, standing beside her, regarded her with that quiet gravity which spoke more of pity than triumph. The hypnotic influence, he explained, was achieved through long repetition, gentle phrases, spoken when her mind was most vulnerable. Pembroke's remorse had turned malignant. He compelled her to act out the very punishment he believed divine justice demanded of him. The relic was his guilt made manifest, and in destroying it, he sought to destroy himself. I could scarcely trust myself to speak. "To think," I murmured, "how near we came to tragedy." Holmes gave a faint smile. "We often stand upon the edge, my dear Watson, but reason, when steady, is a stronger guardian than fate." He turned to the window, where the first rays touched the spire of the little church beyond. "Observe, Watson, the light breaks even upon the graves. There is a lesson there, if one cares to see it." I followed his gaze in silence, my mind haunted by the events of the night, the glowing footprints, the broken vial, the man undone by the weight of his own sin. Holmes lit his pipe and spoke at last, almost to himself. "Evil, Watson, seldom walks unseen. It merely waits for the hour when reason sleeps, and calls itself faith." We left Wiltshire that afternoon, the ivory cross sealed within a constable's satchel. Yet I could not forget the image of Pembroke's bowed figure in the dawn, nor Holmes's quiet words that still echoed within me. a reminder that even the keenest mind cannot cure the sickness of the soul. The hours that followed were among the most solemn I can recall in all my long association with Sherlock Holmes. The violence of the night had passed, leaving behind a strange and heavy stillness that seemed to pervade every corner of the old rectory. The lamps burned low, and the faint crackle of the hearth was the only sound that stirred the silence. Miss Marbury lay in the adjoining chamber under my care, her face tranquil in sleep, though pale from exhaustion. Reverend Fairbairn sat nearby, his hands clasped and his head bowed, a man wrestling with gratitude and remorse in equal measure. Holmes stood by the fire, his tall, lean figure motionless, his eyes fixed upon the dying embers. There was about him that peculiar abstraction I had come to recognize, the quiet before the unveiling, when his mind, having traversed the labyrinth, stood at last upon the threshold of truth. "Holmes," I ventured softly. "It is over then?" He did not turn his head. "Over, yes, though not ended. For guilt does not die, Watson. It merely changes its habitation." The words struck me with an unease I could not wholly define. He drew up a chair, motioned for Fairbairn to sit, and said gravely, "You shall hear now, sir, the true history of your so-called cursed relic. It is a tale not of spirits, but of men, and of how sin, once sown, grows root and branch across the years." And so began that extraordinary account which laid bare the tragedy of the Ivory Cross. "Colonel Arthur Marbury," said Holmes, "was a soldier of courage and of greed. During the Indian Rebellion of 1857, he and Major Pembroke were stationed near Cawnpore. In the chaos that followed the massacre there, a small shrine was plundered, a relic of great sanctity among the local people, carved, it is said, from the tusk of a white elephant dedicated to St. Aurelius. To them, it symbolized purity and protection. To Marbury and Pembroke, it was but a spoil of conquest. "They stole it," Holmes continued, his voice low and deliberate, "and in the act, blood was spilled. The priest who guarded it was slain. His death, Pembroke's first unacknowledged crime. That relic, the ivory cross of St. Aurelius, was carried to England as a trophy, an object of pride and of secret dread. But what man carries from the field of guilt, he carries into his soul." Fairbairn's lips moved soundlessly, while I sat transfixed by the sombre music of Holmes's words. "Years passed," he went on. "Marbury settled into domestic life, but Pembroke lived alone. The one forgot, the other remembered too well. It was not the cross that was cursed, but the men who defiled it. For sin, Watson, is the most faithful of relics. It survives every generation of those who bear it." He turned to Fairbairn, his tone softening. "Your household suffered not by miracle, but by the long shadow of conscience. Pembroke's mind had warped under the weight of memory, until he saw in that object both his accuser and his salvation. The deaths, the illness, the terror, all were contrived to feed his delusion and bury his guilt." Holmes paused, drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, and then resumed in his clear, incisive manner. "The physical evidence was plain enough once one dismissed the veil of superstition. Consider, Watson, the fine ivory dust found upon the victims' beds. What appeared spectral was, in truth, chemical." He took a small glass vial from his pocket and held it to the light. "Arsenic trioxide, ground fine and mixed with traces of ivory powder, a deadly compound and the simplest disguise for murder. Pembroke, familiar with poisons from his service abroad, had used it to create the illusion of a supernatural blight. Each death, the maid's, the fire in the vestry, Miss Marbury's illness, was designed to strengthen the myth of the cursed relic and divert suspicion from himself." Fairbairn covered his face with trembling hands. "Then he meant to destroy us, to atone by further sin." "Not destroy, Reverend," said Holmes gently. "He meant to silence the relic's last witness. His hand, scarred by the cross's molten surface, betrayed both his crime and his torment. You recall, Watson, that peculiar burn shaped like a cruciform upon his palm. It was the mark of his own attempted purification. Fire and poison, twin instruments of his madness. Holmes rose, his expression grave yet calm. The phosphorescent trail, too, was no miracle. The phosphorus I placed upon the relic merely revealed what guilt had already traced. Pembroke's hand led us unerringly to his door. He turned toward the window where dawn's first light shone pale against the glass. And so, Watson, we see again that the ghost which haunts mankind is not born of death, but of remembrance. The curse of the ivory cross was conscience, and nothing more. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes half veiled in the dim glow of the hearth. There remains one figure in this mournful drama, said he, whose silence was purchased not by guilt, but by death. The servant, Ramdas. Reverend Fairbairn looked up sharply. You mean he was murdered? Beyond question, Holmes replied. The official verdict of suicide was convenient, not conclusive. Ramdas was no man to take his own life while the relic he revered lay in profaned hands. I have traced his movements through the days preceding his death, his visits to the vestry, his inquiries in the village, his desperate attempts to warn those who would not listen. When at last he confronted Pembroke, his knowledge sealed his fate. Holmes rose and paced the room. Consider, Watson, the so-called drowning. The body found half submerged in the Avon, the marks upon the throat attributed to weeds, the pendant missing from his neck. It was a clumsy deception by a man too practiced in violence to forget its habits. Pembroke, soldier and strategist, understood concealment as he understood discipline. His influence over the local authorities ensured that the matter was buried, literally and legally. He paused before the fire, his expression hardening. It was the last act of a soldier whose courage had curdled into fear. He killed to silence the only witness who could expose the theft and the blood behind it. Ramdas's loyalty outlived him, for it was his shadow that guided me. The vanished pendant, the prints by the river, the faint traces of ivory upon his clothing. In death, he spoke more plainly than any living man. Fairbairn covered his face with trembling hands. Then there was never a curse, he murmured. Holmes turned gravely. No, only justice. Delayed, but not denied. Holmes's account, once begun, flowed with the clarity of reason cutting through fog. You see now, Watson, he said, how the web was woven. Pembroke, maddened by guilt, sought to erase the last trace of his crime. Miss Marbury, as the colonel's niece, was both heir and witness. She held unknowingly the proof that could have unmade him. Hypnotism was his instrument. Through it, he compelled her to act the part of fate itself, to restore the relic to what he deemed its rightful grave. Fairbairn's lips moved in silent horror. Then her soul was blameless, Holmes interjected firmly. She was the weapon, not the wielder. The poison, the illusions, the night wanderings, all were extensions of his own deranged conscience. Pembroke sought not absolution, but annihilation. The deaths that followed were but echoes of that single act of desecration in India. He turned to me then, and his voice softened into something almost philosophical. It is remarkable, Watson, how conscience, once perverted, imitates divinity. The man who cannot repent invents his own form of judgment. In Pembroke's mind, the relic had become a living curse, and every act of violence a kind of ritual penance. As the first light of morning crept into the room, Holmes drew his coat closer and looked toward the fading embers. There is no curse, Watson, said he, only memory, sharpened to the edge of madness. I sat long after he had ceased speaking, haunted by those words. Outside, the bells of the small church began their morning chime, solemn and subdued. Fairbairn knelt in silent prayer beside the fire, while Holmes, calm as ever, stood at the window, watching the mist rise over the fields. And in that pale dawn, I thought I understood what he meant, that the darkest ghosts are not those that haunt the night, but those that live within the human mind. Several days had passed since the melancholy events at Wiltshire, and once more I found myself in the familiar surroundings of Baker Street. The ceaseless hum of London life drifted faintly through the fog-veiled panes, mingling with the soft ticking of the clock upon the mantel. The warmth of our own hearth, so often the stage for mysteries untangled and truths revealed, seemed doubly welcome after the shadows and moral perplexities of that rural tragedy. Yet Holmes, though seated in his customary armchair, betrayed little of his usual serenity. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the flames as if they concealed some lingering spectre of the past. The easy irony that so often attended his speech had vanished. His silence was not the silence of rest, but of thought. I ventured a remark upon the dreary weather, but he made no reply. Only once did he stir, to draw from the table the small wooden box in which the case papers were kept. He opened it, glanced at its contents, and closed it again with a faint sigh. "It is curious, Watson," he murmured at length, "how little man learns from the ghosts he himself creates." After that, he fell once more into silence. I took up the evening paper, but found my attention straying back to my companion, to the steady glow of the fire upon his sharp profile, and the shadow that seemed to lie behind those grey eyes which had seen too much of human frailty. It is in moments of quiet that one best perceives the moral weight of our adventures, and that night I found my thoughts returning to the strange affair of the Ivory Cross. The tragedy had been no mere crime of circumstance. It was a parable of conscience disguised in the language of superstition. How often, I reflected, does mankind clothe its cruelties in the garb of the supernatural, calling vengeance a curse, or madness a divine visitation? The mind, when burdened by guilt, seeks refuge in the irrational, as though the imagination could absolve what conscience condemns. Reverend Fairbairn's shaken faith, Miss Marbury's trance-like bondage, even Pembroke's desperate creed of retribution, all were but stages in that same descent from reason to terror. Holmes alone had stood unmoved amidst the storm, his intellect as steady as a compass in darkness. Yet his rationalism, though I admired it, seemed to me at times almost inhuman. Where others saw sin and sorrow, he saw merely cause and effect, moral sickness diagnosed with the calm of a surgeon. Still, I could not but revere that clarity of mind which cut clean through deception and fear. In an age still half enslaved to the shadows of credulity, Holmes was as a torchbearer, cold perhaps, but luminous. As I watched him now by the fire, silent and introspective, I wondered whether even he, in his secret heart, had felt the chill of that invisible thing which men call evil, and which logic alone can never wholly dispel. It was near midnight when Holmes stirred at last from his reverie. Without preamble, he said quietly, "There are no curses, Watson, only debts unpaid and consciences that whisper too late." The words seemed to me at once simple and profound. He spoke not as the detective of fact, but as the philosopher of motive. "Pembroke," he continued, "was not destroyed by superstition, but by memory. The most merciless judge sits not in the heavens, but within the human breast. Once it stirs, neither reason nor repentance can silence it." He leaned forward, the firelight throwing vivid relief upon his austere features. "You recall how every sign in that case bore the stamp of retribution. The poison, the burn upon his hand, the nocturnal wanderings. Each was but conscience externalized, his own spirit forcing him toward confession through madness. I have seen the same principle at work 100 times, though seldom in forms so tragic. The cleverest villain fears not the scaffold, but himself." There was a pause, broken only by the crackle of the coals. Then he added more softly, "We call such things curses because it is easier to name them thus than to own their source." I watched him with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. The light of the flames glimmered in his eyes, and for a moment I thought I glimpsed in their depth not merely intellect, but pity, the compassion of a man who, knowing all, must forever stand apart from the frailty he understands too well. 2 days later, duty called me to Scotland Yard, and I took the opportunity to view the relic which had been the centre of so much ruin. It lay within a locked cabinet among other tokens of crime: a blood-stained knife, a torn banknote, a rusted pistol. Yet none seemed to me so sinister as that small, pale cross, whose surface glimmered faintly beneath the lamplight. It was beautiful still, the work of a delicate hand, its serpentine carvings softened by age, and I could well believe how men had mistaken its artistry for sanctity. But in that moment, it appeared to me not holy, but profane, a symbol not of faith, but of what faith becomes when seized by greed and stained with blood. I stood long before it, pondering the frailty of human devotion. What begins as worship may end as idolatry. What is sacred in spirit becomes dangerous in possession. That object, carved perhaps with piety centuries ago, had passed through the hands of plunderers, hypocrites, and the damned, until its innocence, like theirs, was utterly defiled. When I left the yard, I felt as though I had looked upon the visible relic of folly, not divine, but human. The fire had burned low when I returned that evening to Baker Street. Holmes's violin lay upon the table, untouched. The silence was of that rare kind which carries reflection rather than rest. Outside, the fog had thickened, and from far away the city clock tolled the midnight hour. Holmes did not speak, nor did I interrupt his thoughts. There are times when words are but a veil drawn over understanding. I watched the last embers sink into darkness and thought of the cross, of Pembroke's face as he fell, of Clara's pale hand clutching salvation in terror, of Fairborn's prayer murmured amid the smoke of moral ruin. Holmes moved at last, throwing the spent ashes into the grate. "There is one comfort, Watson," he said quietly. "Even when man errs most grievously, it is conscience that drives him. And that at least is the seed of redemption." He turned away then, his features lost in shadow, and I knew that no further word would pass between us that night. Yet as I sat alone, watching the faint ivory glimmer fade from memory to ember, I felt that its light, however tarnished, had not been entirely extinguished. For even folly, when confessed, may yet serve wisdom. Holmes sat motionless by the fire, his long fingers folded beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon the slow collapse of the embers. For a while neither of us spoke. The faint rumble of carriages from Baker Street was the only sound that marked the passing of the hour. At last he said quietly, "Man is forever haunted, Watson, not by curses, but by his own reflection. Pembroke mistook conscience for fate, yet it was neither India nor the relic that condemned him. It was the memory of what he had been, and what he could no longer bear to be." He turned his gaze upon me with that rare gentleness which sometimes softened his analytical tone. "There are crimes," he added, "in which justice arrives not from the gallows, but from within the guilty soul itself." I could find no reply. The last flame flickered and went out, leaving only the faint ivory glimmer upon the mantel, cold, pale, and eternal. And now, dear listener, I put a question to you. Do you believe Pembroke's punishment was justice, or merely the echo of madness? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if the shadows of Baker Street intrigue you, as they do me, I invite you to follow for more tales of mystery, reason, and the strange workings of the human heart.